Okay. Today we start with the introduction to Hegel, which is, I'm sorry to say, quite complicated. Everything to do with the Germans is quite complicated. And with Hegel, it is even more complicated. Hegel is one of the most difficult philosophers to read and understand because his writing is extremely dense. You can divide Hegel's writing into three periods, three phases. The first phase is his days at the Jena University. And these are called Jena Writings, which are quite clear and not so difficult to understand. Now, that is probably due to the fact that Hegel was 18 years old when he wrote the Jena Writings. So, when I say quite clear, I'm using it in a comparative fashion compared to his writings that came later, that followed the Jena Writings. The Jena Writings are comparatively, again, easier to read and they are less dense. Now, the second phase of his writings comprises of these are two writings I'm citing. Most of the core of his philosophy lies in the phenomenology of the spirit. And along with my mouth is drying up. Unfortunately for us, it is in the phenomenology of the spirit that we have most of what we need to understand or we want to understand. So that is our problem. When we come to the phenomenology of the spirit, we'll find that fortunately for you, you don't have to read it. If you read it, it's like banging your head against a wall. No, nothing seems comprehensible. You read a sentence and start this next sentence, and it looks like, it seems like you've forgotten what the previous sentence was. It takes very, very concentrated and undisturbed reading to understand the phenomenology of the spirit and even the philosophy of history. This is the second phase of his writings. If you take the third phase, once again, Hegel becomes accessible to his readers. When I say he becomes accessible, we are still talking relatively, and is a bit easier to read and to understand. And this phase is characterized by his work Philosophy of right is also something that is of use to us, just as the phenomenology of the spirit is. In fact, if you put his arguments from the phenomenology of the spirit and the philosophy of right, you will get a pretty decent idea of the Hegelian enterprise. Let me reframe that. The Hegelian philosophical enterprise. Now, in all these works that we have cited, you'll see Hegel is somehow or the other addressing himself to the problematics posed by people like Rousseau and Kant. Actually, we should have put that point first. With Rene Descartes, we have the starting of a tradition of saying that the mind and body are two separate entities, and this is called the Cartesian. Some people call it duality, which is a correct way of addressing it. Some people say dualism, Uh, Dualism is not very wrong, but it is not an appropriate way of putting what Rene Descartes had in his mind, because if you say it's a dualism, then it becomes an ism, and that means it's a systematized uh, thought, which it is not. It is just a duality, which is a part of a larger system of thought. And in duality in itself doesn't really become a thought, so to speak. Now, in Rousseau, we find alienation and in Kant, we find antinomies. We've done the alienation bit in Rousseau, but we haven't done the antinomies in Kant. And for people like Kant, the antinomies are an important aspect of human thought, because Kant saw these antinomies. By definition, an antinomy is a problem without a solution. That's what it is, right? So Kant saw these antinomies as restrictions on human knowledge. And we find in Rousseau this whole thing called alienation, because of the bourgeois society generated by capitalism. And he says, by fostering competition, these the bourgeois society actually nurtures and grows alienation. Now, here are opposite categories. Duality, of course, means there's an opposition, mind-body duality. Alienation due to capitalism, where there's growth, but at the same time, you're becoming more and more alien from society. That is yet another dualistic proposition. Antinomies are things that run parallel, so they never meet. That is why they are also to be seen as dualities. So Hegel is essentially trying to give us a picture of the world in which he's trying to wipe out these contradictions. He's trying to wipe them out in the sense that he believes that it is through rationality, it is through the proper comprehension of the world by using the dialectic, or if you like, the dialectical method in Marx and Engels. You find the dialectic, but it is not used as a method. It is used by Marx to show that history moves due to dialectical forces being at work, dialectical forces being at work. That is why you find history moving and changing. Okay, so he sees two dominant classes which are in opposition with each other, and in the feudal period it is the aristocracy versus the servant. In the capitalist period, it is the capitalist and the worker who are in opposition with each other. So he saw all history as history of class struggle. And it is because of this class struggle that periods of history change. That is the proposition of the dialectic that we find in Marx. He calls this historical materialism. I've, of course, oversimplified it. When we come to Marx, I shall talk about it in detail, and you'll see the complexity of the argument that was the argument that was given by Marx. Now, if you look at Hegel or Engels, he says the movement of matter itself is dialectical. So that phrase, dialectical materialism, which is attributed to Marx, is actually not a Marxian phrase. Marx never talked about materialism being dialectic. Okay, so that's an Engelsian concept, one that he wrote in his book, The Dialectics of Nature, and the conflation of dialectical materialism with Marxist thought is something that generates irresolute and very, very complex problems for Marx and portrays him in a very bad light. So what you need to understand is that you have to take Engels as Engels and Marx as Marx, though your syllabus says it's what should I say? Your syllabus basically says Marx is the one who had dialectical materialism, but that is wrong. It's one of the many different folds that are there in your syllabus. So you see that the Hegelian dialectic is purely a methodology or a method, if you want, of understanding history, how history is moving. That is what we understand by, he says, best by using the dialectical method. So it's only a methodology, mind you. Now, another very difficult problem that we have with Hegel is the phenomenology of the spirit. 1 second, please.
Sir?
Yeah.
Hegel spoke about dialectics for the first time.
No?
Socrates spoke.
Yeah, he might have, but as a methodology, dialectics has been used by the Greeks. And if you remember what I told you about Aristotle, Aristotle says structural dialectics were posed by Zeno of the Eleatic school. Aristotle points out that he used structural dialectics. So dialectics is an ancient method It is used by Plato in his dialogues. The dialogues themselves are constructed dialectically. If you look at Plato, even his Republic is something which is written with dialectics, or rather using the dialectical methodology, because there are a number of conversations between Socrates and other sophists, even in the Republic. And there too, he uses dialectics. But you must understand that the Greek usage of dialectics is significantly different from the modern usage of dialectics. Hegel is definitely the first person to use the dialectical method in the modern period. And after him, Marx and Engels used it. Actually, Marx, like I told you, Marx used it differently. Engels used it differently. Engels thought he was being consistent with the Marxian usage, but he wasn't. Ultimately, it was Lenin who clubbed all these people and himself and his thought process into one body of thinking called Marxism. So Marxism is actually the Marxism as is commonly and popularly known all over the world, very simplified. This is something that was done by Lenin. Lenin wanted to make a complex system of thought accessible to people, because he believed that if it was accessible to people, then people would understand and follow what was written, become revolutionaries, and have revolution and bring in what do we say? They usher in a society which does not have classes, and a society in which some people don't work and some people work. That, he said, will go. So this is a thing that he did uh, as a he did this as a strategy to make Marxism accessible to all people and simplify it so that people understand what they are fighting for. That is what you see in Hegel, in Lenin. But the method of dialectics being used in the modern period is first by Hegel, and you could say that in Hegel, the dialectics as a method, or if you like, a methodology, is something that, how should I put it? It is something which is unique. Nowhere in Greek history do you find people using the dialectic as Hegel uses it. So in a way, you're right. He's the first. And he's not the first to use it, but he's definitely the first to use it in the way in which he used it, which is combination of opposites and the reconciliation of the tension that exists between two opposite categories in your mind. The Hegelian dialectic is purely mental. It's a methodology devised to understand the world. As we go to his other things, such as what should I say, such as cunning of reason and all those things, you will find why Hegel's dialectic is the first of its kind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the purpose of him using this method in his writing?
Understanding the purpose of history.
Okay.
He believes that history has a purpose, and the purpose of history is not, it doesn't have anything to do with the purpose of human beings and their society. Human beings play an extremely important part in the realization of the purpose of history, but they are not the central players in that realization of the purpose of history. So you see, he is talking about history also in a way in which nobody before him talked about. And so we also have to wade through phenomenology of the spirit, and we have to distinguish the Hegelian usage of phenomenology from the ontological usage of phenomenology, which is done by first by Nietzsche and later on in a proper organized fashion by Martin Heidegger. So I think I have to stop here now that you have another class. So see you in the evening where and I'll be putting the link in the AVR Institute group for the evening class, and that is where we will be doing Bentham, and hopefully we'll finish Bentham today. As far as this is concerned, we have to go through, we are not going to start with this. We have to go through the German Enlightenment, the philosophy of Descartes, Kant, Rousseau, not in detail, but those bits and pieces that are absolutely necessary for our understanding of, the philosophy of Hegel, because most of it is a response. Okay, then. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, see you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. See you in the evening.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.